9.83秒，呢個就係跑完100米，仲可以將自己嘅名刻入歷史所需要嘅時間。咁但係究竟要付出啲乜嘢先可以打造一個可以用呢種速度移動嘅人體機器呢？咁成日好多人都話俾你聽，速度呢淨係天賦嚟嘅，你一係天生就有，一係就冇。亦都有好多人話俾你聽，如果你想跑得快啲，你就需要蹲得更加重，推得更加快。咁但係我今日嘅嘉賓就知道呢個唔係一個正確嘅諗法嚟嘅。咁 Rolf Ohman 咧係喺精英運動表現領域中好受尊敬嘅一個專家嚟嘅。咁佢處理嘅咧就係人體潛能最極限嘅嗰一頂端啦。咁合作嘅對象包括地球上面跑得最快嘅運動員啦，其中就有亞洲男子100米紀錄保持者蘇炳添。咁佢理解生物理學、神經系統，同埋佢理解點樣去將一個優秀嘅運動員同埋世界級短跑選手區分出嚟嘅一啲無形嘅力量。咁今日佢將會揭開速度訓練入邊最大嘅迷思，解釋點解太過用力反而會令你變得更加慢，同埋分享嗰啲頂尖嘅短跑選手嘅秘密。而啲原則咧，其實任何人都可以用嚟釋放自己最大嘅潛能嘅。等我哋歡迎 Rolf Ohman。咁 Rolf， 我哋大家都有一個錯誤嘅諗法度開始先啦。咁好多運動員想要變快啦，就係咁加重佢哋嘅槓鈴啊、深蹲啊，要孭到好重啊，將自己練到好有力量。咁大家去到場上面咧，個速度一樣都係咁慢嘅。咁你喺健身房入邊嘅力量咧，就唔等於我哋嘅速度。咁大家究竟係咪誤解咗人體跑動機制嘅邊一個關鍵啊？
Well, basically, if you look at what I've been doing for, I don't know, 30 years probably, is that there's a bunch of us that realized a long time ago that what happens eccentrically is of the utmost importance. And if we fast forward and look at the technology that we've got at our disposal today, we've been able to measure and follow what happens eccentrically. So basically, you have two triggers. One is extreme load, which would be, let's say, your weightlifters, but primarily powerlifters. So if you load up a barbell and do a squat with a huge amount of weight, and you do that often, the problem is that you're going down very slow and you are also moving up very slow. The other trigger is velocity. So there are two different triggers. So we did a project, I don't know, probably about 15 years ago in Sweden, where we looked at a powerlifter who was a world record holder in the bench press, and we compared him to an Olympic finalist in the men's discus. And now the discus thrower had a PB of about 215 kilos in the bench press, which is not too bad. The powerlifter, he had a PB of 360. He was a world record holder. So we started looking at 20 kilo increasements from 20 kilos all the way up to their maximums for the day. The interesting thing was that throughout the whole sequence of lifts, the powerlifter, his velocities were much slower than the discus thrower. Now, even at the maximum weight of the day for the discus throw, which happened to be that day, if I remember right, was 212.5 kilos. But the discus thrower was still moving 212 much faster in both directions than what the powerlifter did with the same amount of weight. Now we've got to realize that this was virtually the day one rep max for the discus thrower. For the powerlifter, it represented about 65% of his 1 RM. So given the literature that is out there, the powerlifter should have been able to move 212 kilos very fast, but that's not the case. So we've known for a while that this was the case. We had a project in Sweden where I worked in pro hockey, and during the period that I worked in pro hockey, there was a project done where they looked at only the eccentric phase. So all they did was lower super maximum weights, and the hockey players would have to try and resist 300, 340, 360 kilos for 3, 4, 5 seconds. The weight would stop, and then it'd be hoisted back up again, and then they would do another rep. So they would do singles, but sets of 3 or 4 singles. And then they did a protocol for this. And then they looked at things like, speed, power, and so forth. And what we saw was that these guys got immensely strong, but there was no speed, no power, none. It virtually bottomed out. So therefore, we've known for a while that there are two triggers. Now in sprinting, of course, if we look at then what we call the time to peak velocity, which is an acceleration index, which is comparable to ground contact time. So if you've got let's say a world-class sprinter that's in the ground 85 milliseconds. Now, if you're doing squats that are taking 200 milliseconds, that's more than double as slow as what we are going to do on the track. So the problem that we've always had, and why we do, there's about 5 of us that work very closely together, and we've done a lot of research and we talk to each other constantly. And what we found is if you are training at say 250 milliseconds in the gym, but your event, in this case sprinting, demands 85 milliseconds, the problem is that we've got a massive big gap there between what we're doing in the gym and what we're going to have to do out on the field. Now the problem is then, okay, we can do a few things like plyometrics, we can do assisted plyometrics, we can do some assisted runs. We've got the technology now with the electronic resistance devices. There's a few of them on the market where you can do either resisted runs or assisted runs. So then we can move this gap, let's say, to here, but we've still got this gap here. Now the problem with that gap is if it's too big, which it is in most cases, you are not going to get any benefit apart from maybe the first 4-6 steps coming out of the blocks. You'll become very good at doing that, but once you get going, it's all over. You simply will not be able to sustain that acceleration because number one, the velocities that you will be moving and required to generate power at is just too big. It's too fast. The other thing that will happen is that when you are doing these types of very slow, in our repertoire, slow movements, the elasticity that you will get from those movements will be slow elasticity. Now, if you think about a world-class sprinter, they are, depending on the length of the sprinter, a short sprinter has more frequency than Bolt, for example, took about 4.4 strides a second. Somebody like Sue that I work with in China with Randy, he was up at around 5. So he takes 5 steps a second. Now, the problem then becomes that when you are doing things that will more or less put a cap on your elasticity at velocity, you're going to be in trouble, because what happens then is once you get out of acceleration, you can't increase things because you simply can't reposition fast enough. For example, a lot of people have looked at, and it's not a big deal, and it's very, very true. If you've got weightlifters, especially in the lighter classes, 90 kilos, 75 kilos classes, they're pretty athletic guys. Now, if they can run, and which quite a few of them actually can, that you'll see that they will beat some of the best sprinters in the world over 10, 15, maybe even 20 meters. After that, it's all over because they simply can't reposition any faster than what they're moving at about those meterage. So once they get out to about 7-8 meters per second, that's it. It's finished. Now, some of them have run. I mean, we know shot putters, for example, huge big shot putters in the past that have run sort of 10.9 and so forth. And don't get me wrong, 10.9 is fast. You know, most human beings will never run that fast. But in sprinting terms, 10.9 is, well, you won't win an Olympic final for women with 10.9. So if you're a man running 10.9, it's not going to do you much good at all. So in other words, those types of training then, where a lot of people think you've got to do Olympic lifts, is a, you know, it's a partial truth. Do we do Olympic lifts? Yes, we do. but it's during the period where we develop athletes. They might be weak when we get them, and they have some issues, and then we strengthen them. We use conventional equipment and conventional exercises to build a foundation or build the capacity. But then things it has to be geared up.
我之前有睇過你啲片嘅，咁啊係你其中一個講座入邊，咁就係關於翻你話要跑得快，我哋人要有 elasticity 彈性，呢個係最重要嘅一樣嘢。咁你可唔可以解釋下究竟乜嘢係彈性 elasticity？ 咁同埋我哋究竟點樣去訓練好呢樣嘢呢？
Well, if you think, when you're a kid, or maybe in your early, sort of when you're 20 or 30 years old, whatever, maybe you've been out on a golf course or out on a field somewhere where there's a hill, and then you've run down the hill and things start to pick up, and it doesn't take long before your legs are turning over like crazy. And then all of a sudden you reach the elastic threshold. And what happens then? Boom, you fall over. You simply can't get your foot around fast enough to meet the ground. And in the case of sprinting, what happens is that usually then they'll get their leg around. So here's the leg, it's about to come down, and there it hits at support. It'll get stuck here. So in other words, we're braking, and that's what will inevitably happen. So with the technology that we have today, where we can, with an electronic device that's helping us attain these speeds, which is overspeed. Let's say, for example, you've run a flying 20 meters in training, and you have run 10 meters per second. That's absolutely what you can do on your own. Does that mean that your elastic threshold is 10 meters per second? Not necessarily. Sometimes it is. Many times, if we give you some assistance so that to get over that, in other words, we provide some more horsepower. So we give you a bigger engine, which means you can now move faster horizontally. So we can now increase your speed to, let's say, 10.2 meters per second, 10.4 meters per second. And then we look at some numbers, and we can then ascertain whether or not you are positive, which means that you're getting enough speed and you're able to get into support position without blocking. And if, let's say, for example, everything's okay at 10.2, then we increased it 10.4. And let's say everything's okay at 10.4. Then we try 10.6, and then all of a sudden these figures creep up, which means, nope, I'm not able to get around. We back off a little bit, and then we see, okay, this athlete right here and now at this day and this time, the maximum velocity that this person can reposition is 10.5 meters per second. So that gives us now an idea that, okay, so now when we're doing max speed and we want to develop max speed, if we stop at 10 meters per second, that is not max speed. That's what my horsepower can do. But if I give the body a little bit of, like, virtually we're helping them run downhill, but we're running on the horizontal. So therefore we can then train the neuromuscular system to adapt to a higher velocity. And the interesting thing that we found is that speed is very much similar like lactic acid. If you've got a lactic threshold that you want to move, if you go through the lactic threshold, the lactic threshold will not move. The only thing that'll happen is the athlete will become more accustomed to pain. So they'll be able to endure more pain, but the lactic threshold, it's stuck. So what you've got to do is just hit it, bang, bang. So you push it up this way. Speed works the same way. If you go through your elastic threshold, then you won't go anywhere. In fact, you'll get injured. But if you back off just a slight bit and allow the body to adapt, and you open up new neural pathways, then this will happen. But now comes the big but. We've done a couple of my colleagues here in Australia who run the Melbourne CBD Physio Clinic, Nick Cross and Tim, they did a tissue sampling study or tissue compliance study a while back. And what they looked at is what actually happens and what's the difference between a 10-60 sprinter and a 10 flat sprinter tissue-wise. Well, there's a huge difference. In other words, you've also got to allow for the tissue in hamstrings, in calf muscles and tendons and ligaments and everything. They've got to adapt to these new velocities progressively. You can't just all of a sudden decide, okay, we're going from here to here. Then you're going to be in trouble.
咁你合作個人啦，係我哋人類嘅基因嘅天賦最頂嘅0.01%。咁好似蘇炳添呢啲速度咁快，快到大部分人根本就冇得辦法想像嘅啲選手啦。咁當你喺度指導呢啲級別嘅運動員嘅時候，你實際上係睇啲咩呢？咁你係調整佢哋嘅肌肉啊，調整佢哋嘅大腦啊，定係佢哋神經系統呢？
Well, I was very fortunate because I worked with Randy for several years in China, and during that time, of course, we had Sue, and we had also 4 very, very accomplished long jumpers. One of them won the world championships and jumped 8:49. But basically, if you look at when Randy started coaching Sue, Randy realized very, very quickly that Sue had a lot of very, very good attributes. But one thing that stuck out was, and this is again reverse engineering, and that is that everything starts from the ground up. So what happens when you run? Well, your foot hits the ground, okay, which means now the foot and the structures up from that, your calf muscles, your quads, your hamstrings, your hip, and so forth, up the chain. All of those different structures need to be and have the capacity to do what we're asking it to do. And in the case of Sue, it was evident when Randy started testing him that his capacities were very, very low. Oh, excuse me. Were very, very low. Thank you. Were very low. In fact, he was so weak in the soleus muscle, which is a very, very important muscle in the calf muscle. It's the most important one. It's the stabilizer. It's the one that takes the brunt of all the forces that's coming into the ground and redirecting it. And Sue was so weak in that particular muscle group that Randy had to bring in some 16-year-old basketball playing girls to get some data from them. That's how weak he was. So the long story was, the first thing that he had to do was very slowly but methodically build up the capacity in his tissues, in his lower legs from the knee down, to be able to handle the forces that his quads and hamstring, his glutes, and his stride frequency and so forth were able to generate.
That's very interesting.
And I've done virtually the same thing with the sprinter that I had here in Australia that I started coaching 3 years ago. He had a 10:40 PB where he'd run that once. He was a 10:50, 55 guy running 21:45 for a 200. And in 3 years, we went to 10:11 and 20:50, and he made the Olympic team.
Wow. 咁喺我哋運動世界入邊啊，我哋成日都會話僵硬並唔係一件好事嚟嘅。咁我哋希望我哋身體啦更加柔軟啦，更加放鬆啦。咁但係我哋去到短跑咧，我成日聽到啲教練講，你一定要有剛性先要跑得快。咁啊，剛性究竟係乜嘢咧？咁同埋點解剛性會令到我跑得更加快咧？
Well, stiffness is built up if you do things progressively with either in the gym or with plyometrics. So that gives the tissue enough time to adapt to what's happening, and the tensile strength is increased. So what happens is that as the muscle and tendons are being stretched, they are able to resist this rather than fighting against it. They are able to resist, and that then means that whatever energy that you've put into the system, you can then extract out of the system. So there won't be any leaks where for example, if you don't have enough stiffness, tendon stiffness, for example, then what you'll see happening is that the athlete will hit the ground, and then rather than just directly popping off the ground, they settle into the ground, and then you can see that things move, like their calf and knee will start moving forward, which means they're stretching different components and therefore building more elasticity to help those muscles that are supposed to be just bouncing off the ground. And of course, that means that it could, we're talking sometimes only a couple of hundredths of or milliseconds. But if you're having to stay in the ground another 300, 400, 500 milliseconds, and you take 47 steps in 100, multiply 3 milliseconds by 47, and then what have you got? You got 0.15. So now instead of running 10 flat, you're going to run 10.15. That's how small the margins are.
咁亦都聽過呢一個講法嘅。咁如果短跑選手用100% 嘅力去跑步咧，反而會因為肌肉太緊張，所以跑得更加慢。咁真正嘅秘訣咧，應該係大概用95% 呢個感覺去跑，咁先可以保持放鬆。咁呢樣嘢係咪真嘅咧？咁太用力係咪真係會令到你見得更加慢？你會點樣教運動員喺極限咁樣爆發嘅同時，又可以維持到身體係放鬆啲嘅
？Yeah, I mean, if you tense up, sure, you're going to tense up. Usually what happens is people will start tensing up in the upper body. They're pumping their arms. They get all stiff in the arms, and then the thoracic spine gets stiff. And some people get, they just stiffen up through the hamstrings and the glutes because they're just trying too hard. I mean, this is part of being able to progressively run faster and faster. So what you can see is that the guys that can run fast, I mean, anybody who can run sort of 10, 30 and down, that from that level and faster, they're just able to do things so much better than everybody else. And one of those things is that they're very, very good at relaxing. So they can actually run at maximum velocity without tensing up. So it has also, of course, to do with technique. If you've got a very good, sound, biomechanically efficient technique where you're not battling against different forces, where there's rotations happening along the longitudinal axis and there's one arm that's flapping about and one leg is doing some silly things, because then all these forces are all, taking each other out, and you've got to sort of redirect things and so forth. And that is going to mean that you're not going to run as fast as you potentially could. So they would then be classified as leaks. But normally in training, what we say, I usually go by the fact that in training, you will probably not run faster than 98% of your one rep of your maximum speeds. If you can run 98% in training, in competition, you should be able to lift yourself that little bit extra, because it's the arousal, it's a competition, that's what we're trained for, and therefore the times will then drop. But 98% is usually what we sort of tried, at least I tried, because at the end of the day, we can do all this training and what we've been discussing, and that's all great. But if the athletes can't recover, and if they break down, it's for nothing. So in other words, I usually, and Randy does the same thing, we're probably guilty of undertraining our athletes to a certain extent. We don't necessarily try to extract everything out of them. We want to keep a little bit in the bank, so as to say, to make sure that we can recover and that we are healthy. Because at the end of the day, that consistency and doing things at a high level is going to give results over the long run, rather than sort of in and out of injuries where you've got to restart things and find your rhythm and find your feeling and so forth in these events, because they are very, very tricky events.
That's some great advice. I think that's how we should work with different athletes, just to make sure they're healthy and consistent.
Yeah.
咁你嘅呢個節目咧，就有好多教練啦，同埋業餘嘅運動員喺度聽緊啦。咁佢哋身邊就可能冇一啲頂尖嘅田徑教練，好似你咁嘅。咁如果佢哋聽日就要去場上面訓練，咁你認為有邊一啲動作或者習慣係佢哋依家要即刻停止嘅，同埋應該要用啲乜嘢去取代咧？
Probably two things I'd say. I discussed with a couple of people yesterday actually about this, and one thing that a lot of people tend to do is absurd warm-ups. Just completely absurd warm-ups. They do so much, it's mind-boggling, and they do a lot of running. They run, I've seen people that run, 1.5, 2 kilometers, and then they do all the sprint drills, and then they do the accessories, and and there's the warm-up is like an hour and a half. And we're sort of standing there. I mean, I work with a coach here in Australia, well, Nick, who's at the Melbourne CBD. He's got one of Australia's best women 100-meter hurdlers. She's run under 13 seconds. And she did a session today with some activated belts and some sprints and so forth. She was in and out of the complex in an hour and 40 minutes. Bang, boof, finished. That's warm up, the session, warm down, gone. 1 hour, 40 minutes. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, you've got to sort of look at what sort of fuel are these athletes using. They're using the phosphate system. And the phosphate system lasts for about 45 minutes to an hour. Then after that, it sort of starts going, and then the glycolytic system will start to jump in a little bit. So we don't really want to be messing around for 2, 3, 4 hours, because then we're shifting energy systems and we're actually starting to get into things that are more endurance based, which is not what we're trying to do. You know, we've got long jumpers that have a 30-meter run up, and they've got to hit sort of 10.8 meters per second and be able to take off and do a technical maneuver from the board into the air and land. Bang, that's it. And then they go and get to sit down for 10, 15 minutes before their next jump. So sprinters are a little bit different. You might have to run 2 rounds in one day, and if you're going to have to run close to your maximum, you've got to be prepared to do that. But you won't do that by doing massive amounts of suboptimal training. When I met Charlie Francis, I was very fortunate early in my career when Charlie was here in Australia before the 88 Olympics. I met Charlie and I bugged a guy for going on 2 weeks. I'm sure he thought I was stalking him. But there was things that Charlie said which were just like eye-openers and sort of like bang. I asked him, for example, how many, when you guys run your 150s, like, your 3x3 by 150s at 85%, when do you do that and how much recovery do you have? And he just looked at me and he said, do you race at 85%? And I looked at him, no. He says, then why are you running rep 150s at 85%? And that was just so, it was just so, the clarity of the whole thing was just like, well, hang on, that makes perfect sense. Why hasn't anybody said that before? So basically, I don't, and my colleagues, we don't do very much at all, except for a bit in the GP. But once we start running, we don't go below 90%, because 90% and above, that is the only thing that we're going to get transferred to the track. If we do stuff at sort of getting to 90% but backwards, it's just okay. So we can be out on the track for a bit longer and we can fiddle around. We can run more 200s, but you only the races that you run one 100, one 200, one 400, and then you might have to come back in an hour or the next day and do it again. But there's no competition that is like 4 by 100 meters, and you get an average time when you've done your 4 by 100. If there was such an event, well, then people would train very differently, but we don't. It's you run once, that's it. So therefore we have to abide by those constrictions which are physiological. So yeah, I would say probably just take it easy with the volume. Volume is something that you build up over a long period of time, and it should in a long-term athletic development, if let's say you're able to run a perfectly put together long-term athletic development, and the athlete is now, let's say, 18, 19, basically the biggest volumes that they'll do in their life, that's around about that age. It does vary a little bit, but you're getting close to it. After that, we start decreasing the volume, and the intensity starts going the other way, because that's the only thing that's going to matter.
Rolf， 呢個就係最後一個問題啦。咁你分析過地球上跑得最快嘅人咁多年之後咧，你覺得頂尖嘅速度咧帶俾你最大嘅覺悟係乜嘢？咁關於人體極限，你學到最重要嘅一堂係乜嘢
？I would go back and say poorly constructed training programs, and then with that, having said that, I would say that most of the time it's doing things that are just too abstract, or they're just crazy exercises. There has been for many years this word function. You've got to train functionally. I think that's probably one of the most misused words in the English language. What is functional, really? You can twist that, and I think it's a perfect word for politicians because they never say what they actually mean.
Yeah.
But I think, going back to what I said earlier, I think that it has to come down to exercise selection, doing things that you need to do at the level you are, and then having a systematic progression of what you're trying to do. And that means that you've got to have ample recovery so that the athlete can recover at every level, so that you don't, sort of forget about recovery and the type of recovery methods that you use. Recovery doesn't just mean that you walk off the track on Tuesday. Wednesday's a rest day, and you lie on your back, flat on your back, and listen to podcasts or whatever you do on Wednesday. That is you might get away with that for a while, but that means you need to go and get massage 2, 3, 4 times a week. You need to get adjustments if you're a jumper, to keep your feet, your knees, your hips in the correct alignment, because you're being banged up every time you jump. And so therefore we do a lot of pool recovery. You use a flotation vest so that you are virtually hanging like a tea bag in water, which then pulls out the spine. So we decompress the spine, and we can then also do just some gentle work that we help the body transport lactic acids and get new nutrients to the system and recover quicker. So recovery it's a science all on its own. And I think that's to sort of, the privilege that I had working with Randy for a bunch of years in China. The thing I think I definitely learned the most from Randy, of all the things that I did learn, was his recovery methods. He's extremely diligent with his recoveries and how he does his recovery. But so are some of the other guys that I work with, like Rainer Ryder and Kenneth Rigberg in Sweden, and a few other guys. And that is basically, the nuts and bolts of it. If you're doing work and you're not recovering completely or adequately, then sooner or later down the track, it'll come back and bite you in the rear end.
Got it. Okay. So thank you so much for today. So giving us so much knowledge about speed. It was a pleasure to have you here on the show today. And yeah, I look forward to meeting you in person one day. 咁喺我哋結束之前，如果有聽眾想更加深入了解 Rolf Ohman， 了解佢嘅研究，或者有教練想追蹤佢嘅課程或者內容嘅話，咁我會喺下面擺低佢嘅 IG 或者喺 description， 咁我擺低佢嘅 IG， 你都可以揾到佢嘅。咁今日同 Rolf 呢個對話咧，再次令我感受到咧，頂尖嘅運動表現咧，從來都唔係表面上面睇到咁簡單嘅。我哋睇到咧，淨係一個人跑得好快，咁但係我哋睇唔到嘅係背後無數關於神經系統啊、力量傳遞啊、節奏控制同埋身體點樣同地面互動嘅一啲細節，又或者呢個就係所有卓越表現最迷人嘅地方啦。咁真正嘅高手往往訓練唔係更加混亂，而係更加簡潔，而唔係更僵硬咁樣用力，而係更精準咁樣去釋放力量。嗰種睇落好似好輕鬆嘅速度，咁背後其實有啲好高層次嘅控制。咁所以對每一位正喺度訓練嘅人嚟講，我哋問嘅問題並唔係我夠唔夠努力，而係應該係問我哋依家做嘅訓練係咪真係有效咁樣轉化到我要嘅運動表現入邊。如果你係呢一集我學到一樣嘢，我希望呢樣嘢係表現並唔係你可以輸出幾多，而係你可唔可以喺正確嘅時間用正確嘅方式將佢表達出嚟。如果呢一集對你有幫助，咁麻煩你幫我分享出去俾你嘅隊友、教練或者任何一位正喺度追求更加高水平嘅人。咁記得訂閱我哋嘅 channel， 亦都係留言區話翻俾我聽，今日最打破你原本認知嘅係邊一個觀念。咁希望今日條片可以幫到你，我哋繼續 move without limits。我係 Jason， 我哋下次見。